The morning sun filtered through the tall windows of Providence Municipal Court as Judge Frank Caprio adjusted his black robe one final time. For 38 years, this courtroom had been his second home, witnessing thousands of cases that shaped not just legal precedents, but human lives. Today, however, felt different. The weight of finality hung in the air like morning mist. Court officers moved with unusual reverence, knowing they were part of something historic. The gallery filled earlier than usual, word having spread through Providence's tight-knit community like wildfire. Television cameras positioned themselves discreetly, ready to capture the end of an era. Judge Caprio's hands trembled slightly as he reviewed his final docket, not from age, but from the emotion of closing this chapter. The bailiff's voice echoed through the chamber. "All rise," the Honorable Judge Frank Caprio presiding. As he took his seat behind the bench, Frank's eyes swept across the familiar faces, court clerks who'd become family, attorneys who'd grown from nervous rookies to seasoned advocates under his watch. The American flag stood proudly beside the Rhode Island banner, silent witnesses to decades of justice tempered with mercy. His gavel, worn smooth by countless decisions, rested beside a single manila envelope marked "Personal Final Case." Frank had planned to make this announcement after the last case, but something told him the day would unfold differently. The courtroom buzzed with anticipation, sensing that today would be more than just another session. "Ladies and gentlemen," Judge Caprio began, his voice carrying the same warmth that had comforted thousands. "Before we begin today's proceedings, I have an announcement." The room fell silent, every breath held in collective anticipation of words they dreaded but knew were coming. "After careful consideration and many sleepless nights, today marks my final day serving as your judge." A collective gasp rippled through the gallery, followed by the sound of someone quietly weeping in the back row. Frank's own voice caught slightly, decades of composure momentarily wavering under the weight of goodbye. "But before I hang up this robe, we have one last case that I believe will remind us all why justice and compassion must always walk hand in hand." The courtroom remained frozen in time, processing the reality that their beloved judge was stepping down. Reporters frantically scribbled notes, knowing they were witnessing the end of Providence's most celebrated judicial career. Young lawyers who had dreamed of appearing before the legendary Judge Caprio felt their hearts sink, realizing this opportunity was slipping away. Court staff members exchanged knowing glances, having kept this secret for weeks as Frank prepared for his transition. The morning light seemed to shift, casting longer shadows across the bench where so many lives had been touched by unprecedented judicial compassion. Frank picked up his reading glasses, preparing for what he sensed would be his most important case yet. The final gavel had not yet fallen, but its echo was already reverberating through the hearts of everyone present. The courtroom door creaked open as Maria Santos slowly made her way inside, her weathered hands gripping a worn wooden cane. At 85, she moved with the careful dignity of someone who had weathered life's storms but refused to be broken by them. Her silver hair was neatly pinned back, and she wore a faded blue dress that had seen better decades but was pressed with meticulous care. Behind thick glasses, her dark eyes held a mixture of nervousness and determination that caught Judge Caprio's immediate attention. She clutched a small brown purse against her chest as if it contained her most precious possessions. The gallery watched in respectful silence as this elderly woman took each measured step toward the defendant's table. Something about her presence commanded a reverence that even the most hardened court officers couldn't ignore. As Maria settled into her seat, Judge Caprio noticed she kept glancing toward a sealed envelope she'd placed carefully beside her purse. Her case file was surprisingly thin for someone her age, just a simple parking violation from downtown Providence 3 weeks earlier. Court clerk Jennifer Martinez whispered to her colleague about how Maria had specifically requested to appear before Judge Caprio, even though other judges could have handled such a minor infraction. The elderly woman's hands shook slightly, not from age, but from what appeared to be overwhelming emotion. She had driven from Federal Hill, a neighborhood Judge Caprio knew well from his own childhood memories. Her accent carried traces of Italian, mixed with decades of American assimilation, a linguistic journey that mirrored many Providence families. "Mrs. Santos," Judge Caprio said gently, his voice carrying the paternal warmth that had become his trademark. "I understand you're here regarding a parking citation?" Maria's eyes immediately filled with tears, though she quickly dabbed them with a tissue from her purse. "Your Honor," she began, her voice barely above a whisper, "I know I broke the parking law and I'm prepared to pay whatever fine you think is fair." But then she paused, looking directly into Frank's eyes with an intensity that seemed to pierce through decades. "However, I have something I've been carrying for 60 years that I believe belongs to you." The courtroom's atmosphere shifted dramatically, confusion and curiosity replacing the routine proceedings everyone expected. Judge Caprio leaned forward, his judicial instincts telling him this was no ordinary case. The silence stretched for what felt like minutes as Maria reached for the mysterious envelope with trembling fingers. Court reporters stopped typing, sensing they were about to witness something extraordinary beyond their usual documentation duties. Defense attorneys in the gallery exchanged puzzled glances, having never seen Judge Caprio look quite so intrigued and emotionally engaged. Maria's breathing became labored, not from physical exertion, but from the weight of whatever secret she was about to reveal. "Before we discuss the parking ticket," she continued, her voice growing stronger with resolve, "I need to tell you about a promise I made to someone very special many years ago." Judge Caprio's professional composure began to crack as recognition flickered in his eyes, though he couldn't quite place where he might have encountered this woman before. The final case of his career was already proving to be unlike anything he had ever experienced in nearly 4 decades on the bench. The parking citation crumpled in Maria's weathered hands told a story far more complex than its simple black ink suggested. 3 weeks earlier, she had parked illegally on Federal Hill, directly in front of Costantino's Venda Ravioli, a neighborhood institution where 3 generations of families had shopped. Security cameras had captured her sitting in her 1998 Honda Civic for over 2 hours, tears streaming down her face as she stared at the familiar storefront. She wasn't shopping or visiting friends. She was gathering courage for something she'd postponed for 6 decades. The parking meter had expired long ago, but Maria remained frozen in her car, clutching the same envelope she now held in court. When the traffic officer approached her window, she didn't argue or make excuses, simply accepting the citation with a quiet "thank you." That parking ticket had become her catalyst, the final push she needed to fulfill a promise that had haunted her entire adult life. The violation occurred on Atwells Avenue, just 3 blocks from where young Frankie Caprio had grown up in a close-knit Italian-American community. Maria had deliberately chosen that spot, knowing the significance it held in the judge's personal history and her own buried memories. The irony wasn't lost on her. She was about to appear before the very person she'd been trying to find courage to approach for years. That afternoon, she had finally walked into the courthouse and specifically requested a hearing before Judge Caprio, even though any municipal judge could handle a simple parking fine. Court clerks found her request unusual, but accommodated the elderly woman's wishes, assuming she simply preferred the judge's well-known compassionate approach. What they couldn't have known was that Maria had been following Frank's career for decades, reading every newspaper article and watching every television segment about his remarkable judicial philosophy. The parking ticket was never really about money. It was about creating an opportunity she'd been too afraid to pursue naturally. Mrs. Santos, Judge Caprio said, reviewing the citation details on his computer screen. I see this happened on a Tuesday afternoon around 2 p.m. Maria nodded, her grip tightening on both her purse and the mysterious envelope as memories flooded back with painful clarity. Your Honor, I wasn't there to shop or visit anyone, she began, her voice carrying the weight of decades of regret. I was there because I made a promise to someone very important 60 years ago, and I've been trying to find the courage to keep it ever since. The judge's eyebrows furrowed with curiosity and concern, recognizing something in her tone that transcended typical courtroom proceedings. That parking spot, Maria continued, was where I last saw someone who changed my life forever, and I've been carrying their final words in this envelope all these years. The simple traffic violation had become a doorway to a story that would reshape everyone's understanding of destiny and delayed justice. Judge Caprio set down the citation and leaned back in his chair, his judicial instincts telling him to abandon normal protocol and listen with his heart rather than his legal training. The courtroom remained utterly silent, sensing they were witnessing something unprecedented in municipal court history. Mrs. Santos, he said gently, forget about the parking fine for now. Tell me about this promise and why it brought you to my courtroom today. Maria's hands trembled as she began to lift the envelope, its edges worn soft from decades of careful handling and countless moments of hesitation. The gallery leaned forward unconsciously, drawn into a drama none of them had anticipated when they'd entered the courthouse that morning. What had started as Judge Caprio's routine final day was transforming into something that would challenge everything he thought he knew about his own past. The parking violation had become merely a pretext for a revelation that had been waiting 60 years to find its moment. Maria's fingers traced the yellowed edges of the envelope with the reverence reserved for sacred relics, its surface worn smooth by decades of handling. The return address, written in faded blue ink, read, Antonio Caprio, 47 Knight Street, Providence, RI, in the careful cursive of someone who valued the written word. Judge Frank Caprio's breath caught in his throat as he recognized his father's handwriting, a script he hadn't seen since childhood, but would recognize anywhere. The envelope bore a postmark from 1963, making it older than many of the people sitting in the courtroom that morning. Maria had kept it sealed all these years, honoring a dying man's final request despite the burning curiosity that had tortured her for 6 decades. Her arthritic fingers struggled with the envelope's edges as emotion overwhelmed her carefully maintained composure. Your father, she whispered, her voice barely audible, made me promise to deliver this only to you, and only when I felt you truly understood what justice meant. Mum, the courtroom atmosphere grew electric with anticipation as Maria began to explain how she had come to possess this mysterious correspondence. I was 25 years old, working as a seamstress in the garment district downtown, she began, her voice growing stronger with each word. Your father was dying in Rhode Island Hospital, and I was volunteering there on weekends, reading to patients who had no family nearby. Judge Caprio's eyes misted as he remembered those final weeks when his father had insisted on spending time alone, claiming he had important business to finish. He told me he had one son who would grow up to be a judge, though you were only 5 years old then, Maria continued, dabbing her eyes with a crumpled tissue. He said this letter contained something you would need to know when you became the man he knew you'd become, but not a moment before. The weight of his father's foresight and planning from beyond the grave left Frank momentarily speechless, struggling to maintain his judicial composure. Your father made me swear a sacred oath, Maria continued, her voice trembling with the emotion of carrying this burden for so many decades. He said I would know the right moment to give this to you, that I would recognize when you had become the kind of judge who truly understood that the law and justice aren't always the same thing. Frank's hands gripped the edge of his bench as he realized his father had somehow predicted not just his career path, but his judicial philosophy. Maria had followed his career through newspaper articles and television appearances, waiting for signs that he had evolved into the compassionate judge his father had envisioned. He told me, "You would face a choice between strict legal interpretation and human mercy, and that when you consistently chose mercy, I would know you were ready." The elderly woman's dedication to this promise had shaped decades of her life, influencing where she lived and how she stayed connected to the Caprio family's journey. Frank realized that his father's wisdom had been guiding his career from beyond the grave through the faithful guardianship of this remarkable woman. The sealed envelope seemed to pulse with significance as Maria held it toward Judge Caprio, her lifetime of faithful stewardship finally reaching its conclusion. "I've watched you on television, read about your cases in the newspaper, and I knew, after seeing how you treated people with such kindness, that the time had finally come." Frank's voice cracked as he asked, "Mrs. Santos, how did you know my father well enough for him to trust you with something so important?" Maria's smile transformed her weathered face as she replied, "Your Honor, your father didn't just trust me with this letter. He trusted me with the truth about who your real mother was." The courtroom erupted in hushed gasps and whispers as the magnitude of her revelation began to sink in among the spectators. Frank felt the world shift beneath him as 60 years of assumed family history suddenly hung in the balance, waiting to be rewritten by whatever secrets lay within that carefully preserved envelope. The final case of his career was about to become the most personal judgment he would ever face. The envelope opened with a sound that seemed to echo through the stunned courtroom, like thunder in a cathedral. Inside, Judge Caprio found not one letter, but 3 separate pieces of correspondence, each written in his father's distinctive handwriting at different stages of his illness. The first letter was dated just weeks after Frank's 5th birthday, when Antonio Caprio had received his terminal diagnosis, but kept it hidden from his family. Maria watched with tears streaming down her face as Frank unfolded the first page, his hands trembling with a mixture of anticipation and dread. "My dearest son," the letter began, "if you are reading this, then you have become the man I always knew you would be, a judge who sees beyond the law to the human heart." The courtroom remained frozen in respectful silence as Frank's voice wavered while reading his father's words aloud. Court reporters had stopped typing, recognizing that some moments transcended official documentation and belonged to the realm of the sacred. The second letter revealed the story Frank had never known about his adoption, written with the careful detail of a man who knew he was running out of time. "Your mother, Isabella Santos, was Maria's older sister, and she died bringing you into this world," Antonio had written with painstaking honesty. Frank's eyes snapped to Maria's face as the family connection became clear. She wasn't just a random hospital volunteer, but his aunt, who had watched over him from a distance for his entire life. "I promised Isabella on her deathbed that I would raise you as my own son, and that you would never want for love or guidance," the letter continued. Maria nodded through her tears, remembering the young man who had taken in an orphaned infant and raised him with such devotion that Frank never suspected the truth. The revelation explained why Maria had moved to Federal Hill decades ago, staying close enough to watch Frank grow up while respecting Antonio's wishes to remain anonymous. Frank's understanding of his entire identity shifted as he realized the woman sitting before him had been his guardian angel throughout his life. The third and final letter contained Antonio's prophecy about Frank's future career and his specific instructions for Maria's sacred mission. "I know my son will become a judge because I see in him the same sense of fairness that made his mother fight for the underdog in our neighborhood," Antonio had predicted with startling accuracy. The letter detailed how Frank's compassionate nature, even as a 5-year-old, had convinced his father that he would grow up to serve justice with mercy rather than rigid law. Maria has promised to watch over you from afar and to deliver this truth only when she sees you have become a judge who chooses heart over harsh judgment. Frank looked up at Maria with new understanding, realizing that every newspaper article about his compassionate rulings, every television appearance showing his empathy, had been monitored by his biological aunt. She will know when the time is right, because she carries your mother's wisdom in her heart, the letter concluded. The courtroom remained spellbound as the intricate tapestry of love, sacrifice, and family loyalty, woven across 6 decades, finally revealed its beautiful pattern. Frank set down the letters and looked at Maria with eyes full of wonder, grief, and overwhelming gratitude for the extraordinary woman who had kept this sacred trust. "You've been watching over me my entire life," he said, his judicial composure completely abandoned in favor of raw human emotion. Maria nodded, her voice breaking as she replied, "Your mother made me promise to make sure you grew up knowing that justice without compassion is just cruelty with a gavel." The gallery sat transfixed, witnessing a revelation that transformed their understanding of the beloved judge they thought they knew completely. Frank realized that every merciful decision he had made, every moment he had chosen empathy over harsh punishment, had been guided by the genetic legacy of a mother he had never known. Court officers discreetly wiped their eyes as they watched their respected judge discover that his legendary compassion wasn't learned behavior, but inherited DNA expressing itself through decades of judicial service. The parking violation that had brought Maria to his courtroom had become the key that unlocked 60 years of hidden family history and love. The Federal Hill neighborhood had been more than just Frank's childhood home. It had been the stage where his biological mother, Isabella Santos, had fought tirelessly for immigrant families facing injustice. Maria's voice grew stronger as she shared memories of her sister, painting a picture of a young woman who had challenged landlords exploiting Italian families and confronted employers who cheated workers out of fair wages. Isabella would stand in front of the courthouse steps every Friday, helping families fill out legal paperwork they couldn't afford a lawyer to handle, Maria recalled, with pride glowing in her weathered features. The neighborhood's tight-knit community had revered Isabella as their unofficial advocate, someone who spoke fluent English and wasn't afraid to challenge authority on behalf of those who couldn't defend themselves. Frank listened in amazement as Maria described how his mother had once organized a rent strike that forced slumlords to provide heat during a brutal winter. The same courthouse steps where Isabella had fought for justice were just floors below where Frank now sat, realizing his entire career had been a continuation of his mother's mission. Maria had moved to Federal Hill not just to stay close to Frank, but to honor the memory of her sister's dedication to their community. "Your mother's promise to help the powerless became your father's promise to raise you with those same values," Maria explained, connecting the threads of Frank's moral development to his inherited sense of justice. Antonio Caprio had deliberately chosen to live in the same neighborhood where Isabella had made her mark, ensuring that Frank would grow up surrounded by the families his mother had helped. Maria had quietly watched as young Frank instinctively stood up for neighborhood kids being bullied, seeing Isabella's protective spirit manifesting in her son decades later. The local shopkeepers on Atwell's Avenue had unknowingly contributed to Frank's education in empathy by sharing stories of the Santos girl who never let anyone push the little guy around. Frank's childhood experiences of seeing elderly Italian grandmothers treated with respect and dignity had shaped his judicial philosophy without him ever knowing the genetic source of his convictions. Maria had coordinated with Antonio to ensure that Frank's exposure to community values happened naturally, never revealing her role in his upbringing. The Providence connection wasn't just geographical. It was a spiritual legacy passed down through generations of fighters for social justice. Every time you showed mercy to someone who couldn't afford their fine, I saw Isabella's spirit working through you, Maria said, her eyes shining with decades of accumulated pride. She described following Frank's career through local newspapers, cutting out articles about his compassionate rulings and keeping them in a scrapbook alongside photos of Isabella from the 1960s. The similarities between mother and son extended beyond their shared sense of justice to their identical way of leaning forward when listening to people's problems, making them feel heard and valued. Maria had attended several of Frank's court sessions over the years, sitting in the back gallery and marveling at how he had naturally developed his mother's ability to see the human being behind every legal case. When you started the television show that made you famous, I knew Isabella would have been so proud to see her son teaching the whole world that courts could be places of healing rather than punishment, Maria continued. Frank's national recognition for compassionate justice had been the final confirmation Maria needed that he had become worthy of receiving his father's letters and learning the truth about his heritage. The Providence community had unknowingly supported Isabella's son in continuing her work, creating a full-circle moment that transcended individual lives. Maria reached into her purse and pulled out a small, faded photograph of Isabella holding infant Frank just days before her death, the only picture that existed of mother and son together. Your father asked me to save this for when you learned the truth, so you could see the love in your mother's eyes when she held you, Maria whispered, placing the precious image in Frank's trembling hands. The black and white photograph showed a young woman whose facial features were unmistakably reflected in Frank's own face, solving the mystery of where his distinctive smile and gentle eyes had originated. Frank studied the image through tears, seeing himself clearly in his mother's expression and understanding for the first time why certain mannerisms had felt so natural throughout his life. The Providence connection was complete. From Isabella's grassroots advocacy to Frank's judicial compassion, the Santos family's commitment to justice had evolved and expanded over 6 decades. Maria's faithful guardianship of this photograph and these memories had preserved not just family history, but the spiritual DNA of a community's fight for dignity and fairness. Frank realized that every person he had helped from his bench was a continuation of his mother's promise to lift up those who couldn't lift themselves. The weight of Maria's revelations crashed over Frank like a tidal wave, explaining mysteries about himself that he had carried unknowingly for decades. His legendary patience with elderly defendants suddenly made perfect sense. He had inherited Isabella's protective instinct for vulnerable community members. The way he instinctively spoke Italian phrases to comfort nervous immigrants wasn't learned behavior, but genetic memory expressing itself through judicial compassion. Frank's colleagues had always marveled at his ability to see beyond surface violations to underlying human struggles, never knowing this gift came from his mother's advocacy work. His famous television catchphrase, "You seem like a nice person," wasn't just judicial kindness, but an echo of Isabella's belief that everyone deserved dignity regardless of their circumstances. The charitable work Frank had done throughout his career, from holiday food drives to scholarship funds, now revealed itself as continuation of his mother's community service legacy. Maria watched with satisfaction as Frank's face showed recognition of how his deepest instincts had been guided by inherited values rather than conscious choice. Frank's mind raced through decades of decisions that now took on new meaning in light of his biological heritage and family mission. The countless times he had waived fines for struggling families suddenly connected to Isabella's fights against exploitative landlords and employers. His instinctive understanding of immigrant experiences stemmed from genetic memory of his mother's work translating and advocating for non-English speakers. The way Frank had always treated his courtroom like a community center where people could find help rather than just punishment reflected Isabella's approach to grassroots justice. His ability to make defendants feel heard and valued wasn't learned from law school, but inherited from a mother who had made every person feel important, regardless of their social status. Frank realized that his father Antonio had deliberately shaped his upbringing to honor Isabella's values without ever revealing the source of those principles. The hidden personal story explained why Frank had never felt satisfied with purely legal solutions when human solutions were possible. "Your whole career has been keeping your mother's promise," Maria said softly, watching Frank process the revelation that his judicial philosophy wasn't his own creation, but inherited mission. Frank's famous empathy for people facing financial hardship connected directly to Isabella's experience growing up poor in Federal Hill during the Depression era. His revolutionary approach to municipal court, treating it as a place of healing rather than punishment, reflected his mother's belief that justice should build communities up rather than tear individuals down. The way Frank had always seen potential for redemption in every defendant mirrored Isabella's faith that people's worst moments didn't define their entire character. His ability to find creative solutions that helped people learn from mistakes rather than simply punish them stemmed from his mother's community organizing experience. Frank's national recognition had elevated not just his own reputation, but the values system Isabella had died defending in their Providence neighborhood. The hidden story revealed that Frank's greatest achievements were actually collaborative efforts spanning 2 generations of Santos family dedication to justice. The courtroom sat in reverent silence as Frank absorbed the magnitude of learning that his entire identity had been shaped by a woman he had never consciously known. His legendary judicial temperament, patient, wise, and infinitely compassionate, suddenly made sense as the natural expression of Isabella Santos's genetic and spiritual legacy. The awards and recognition Frank had received throughout his career now felt like honors, shared with his mother's memory and Maria's faithful guardianship. Frank's ability to connect with people from all walks of life wasn't just professional skill, but inherited understanding of what it meant to fight for dignity in an often undignified world. His famous reluctance to impose harsh sentences reflected Isabella's belief that punishment should educate and heal rather than simply inflict pain. The revelation explained why Frank had always felt driven by something larger than personal ambition. He had been unconsciously fulfilling his mother's unfinished work. Maria's 60-year vigil had ensured that Isabella's sacrifice in giving Frank life would ultimately touch thousands of lives through his compassionate judicial service. Word of the courtroom revelations spread through Providence's Federal Hill neighborhood like wildfire, carried by text messages, phone calls, and the timeless tradition of neighbors talking over backyard fences. Within hours, elderly residents who remembered Isabella Santos began gathering outside the courthouse, many clutching old photographs and handwritten letters from the 1960s advocacy work. Mrs. Concetta Ricci, now 92, shuffled up the courthouse steps with a walker, carrying a faded thank you card Isabella had written after helping her family avoid eviction in 1962. "That girl saved our home," she told a growing crowd of reporters, "and now I understand why her son has such a good heart." Young parents who had benefited from Judge Caprio's mercy over parking tickets and minor violations began arriving with their children, wanting to witness history and express gratitude. The courthouse steps became an impromptu shrine to both Isabella's memory and Frank's career, as flowers and handwritten notes accumulated throughout the afternoon. Local television crews struggled to capture the organic outpouring of community emotion as three generations connected through stories of Santos family compassion. Inside the courthouse, staff members found themselves overwhelmed by phone calls from people sharing their own encounters with Judge Caprio's legendary kindness. Court clerk Jennifer Martinez fielded dozens of calls from defendants whose lives had been changed by Frank's merciful rulings, all wanting to express gratitude now that they understood the deeper source of his compassion. Former defendants called to share stories of how Judge Caprio's understanding had helped them turn their lives around, creating a ripple effect of positive change throughout Providence. The courthouse mailroom reported an unprecedented influx of flowers, cards, and letters as news of Frank's final day and family revelation reached the wider community. Local restaurants began sending trays of food for the courthouse staff, treating the day like a celebration of life rather than a retirement. Social media exploded with hashtags like Judge Caprio Legacy and Isabella Santos as people shared their own stories of judicial mercy and community advocacy. The unexpected response demonstrated how deeply Frank's compassionate approach had touched individual lives and strengthened community bonds across economic and cultural divisions. Providence Mayor Jorge Elorza arrived at the courthouse with a hastily prepared proclamation declaring the day Santos Caprio Family Legacy Day in honor of both Isabella's advocacy work and Frank's judicial service. Local Italian-American organizations that had never known about Isabella's contributions began organizing memorial events to honor her sacrifice and community dedication. The Providence Journal's afternoon edition featured a hastily assembled front-page story about Isabella Santos, including interviews with elderly residents who remembered her fights for tenant rights and fair wages. Channel 12. News interrupted regular programming to broadcast live from the courthouse steps, where community members continued to gather despite the late afternoon chill. Federal Hill business owners began displaying photos of Judge Caprio in their windows, alongside hastily printed images of Isabella Santos found in community archives. The Rhode Island Bar Association announced plans for a scholarship fund in Isabella's name to support law students committed to serving underrepresented communities. What had begun as Judge Caprio's quiet final day had transformed into a city-wide celebration of values-driven public service spanning 2 generations. As evening approached, the crowd outside the courthouse had grown to over 300 people, including many who had driven from neighboring towns after seeing the story on social media. Local priests from St. Bartholomew's Church arrived to offer impromptu prayers for both Isabella's soul and Frank's continued health in retirement. Children who had appeared in Judge Caprio's television show over the years showed up with their parents, some carrying handmade cards thanking him for treating them with respect and dignity. The Providence Fire Department positioned trucks nearby, not for emergency response, but because several firefighters wanted to pay respects to a judge who had always supported first responders. Local food vendors set up along Atwell's Avenue, turning the impromptu gathering into a neighborhood festival celebrating community justice and family legacy. Maria Santos, overwhelmed by the response to her 60-year secret, found herself surrounded by neighbors who thanked her for preserving Isabella's memory and ensuring Frank knew his true heritage. The community's unexpected response proved that compassionate leadership creates lasting bonds that transcend individual careers and connect generations through shared values and mutual respect. Judge Caprio set aside Maria's parking citation and looked at his aunt with eyes transformed by newfound understanding of his life's purpose and genetic destiny. The simple traffic violation that had brought them together seemed insignificant compared to the profound family reunion that had unfolded in his courtroom. "Mrs. Santos," he said, his voice carrying the weight of 6 decades of hidden connection. Not only am I dismissing your parking fine, but I owe you a debt that can never be repaid." The gallery remained spellbound as Frank stood up from behind his bench, something he had never done in 38 years of judicial service. Maria's tears flowed freely as she realized her sacred mission was finally complete, the promise made to a dying man and grieving sister fulfilled at last. The courtroom watched in awe as Judge Caprio stepped down from his elevated position to embrace the woman who had shaped his entire life from the shadows. This wasn't just judicial mercy, it was family reconciliation, orchestrated by Providence and preserved by faithful love. "Your Honor," Maria whispered through her tears, "your mother would be so proud to see the man you became and how you've honored her memory through every compassionate decision." Frank held his aunt's weathered hands, feeling the physical connection to his mother through the woman who had carried Isabella's love forward through decades of patient watching. "Maria, you didn't just deliver my father's letters," he replied. "You delivered my identity and helped me understand why justice and mercy have always felt inseparable in my heart." The profound moment transcended typical courtroom proceedings as Frank publicly acknowledged that his legendary judicial philosophy had been guided by inherited values rather than personal innovation. Court officers and staff members openly wept at witnessing this intersection of family destiny and professional legacy playing out in their familiar workplace. The parking citation lay forgotten on the bench as both Frank and Maria realized they had found something far more valuable than legal resolution. The final judgment of Judge Caprio's career wasn't about municipal violations. It was about recognizing that love and justice had been intertwined in his life since birth. Frank addressed the packed courtroom with the emotional honesty of someone whose entire worldview had shifted in a single morning session. "Today I learned that every merciful decision I've made, every fine I've waived, every defendant I've treated with dignity was really continuing my mother Isabella's work from 40 years before I was born." Die. The gallery erupted in spontaneous applause as Frank's vulnerability and authenticity touched everyone present in ways that formal judicial proceedings never could. Maria beamed with pride as she watched Frank finally understand the spiritual connection between his judicial service and his mother's community advocacy. "This courtroom has been my church for 38 years, Frank continued, "but today I learned it was also my mother's mission field. And you, Maria, were her faithful messenger." The recognition that his career had been guided by forces larger than personal ambition brought Frank a sense of completion he had never experienced. His final judgment merged legal authority with family love, creating a moment of perfect justice that honored both professional duty and personal truth. As Frank returned to his bench one final time, he picked up his gavel not as a symbol of legal authority, but as an instrument of family legacy and community service. "The case of Maria Santos versus the City of Providence is dismissed with gratitude rather than prejudice," he announced, his voice strong and clear despite the emotional intensity of the moment. The courtroom erupted in sustained applause as Frank's final official act demonstrated that mercy had triumphed over rigid law enforcement. Maria clutched Isabella's photograph to her chest, knowing that her sister's sacrifice had produced not just a son, but a legacy of compassion that had touched thousands of lives. Frank's gavel fell for the last time in his judicial career, but the sound resonated with the promise that the Santos family commitment to justice would continue through the countless lives he had influenced. The final judgment proved that sometimes the most important verdicts aren't about guilt or innocence, but about recognizing the love that guides us toward our highest purposes. Justice had been served not through punishment, but through the revelation that mercy and law could coexist beautifully when guided by inherited wisdom and family devotion. In the weeks following Judge Caprio's emotional final case, Providence experienced a transformation that nobody could have anticipated from a simple parking violation hearing. The Isabella Santos Legal Aid Clinic opened on Federal Hill just 1 month after the courthouse revelation, staffed by volunteer attorneys inspired by the story of Frank's mother. Local law students began organizing compassionate justice workshops in community centers, teaching Frank's approach to seeing humanity behind legal infractions. The Providence Municipal Court implemented new protocols, encouraging judges to consider defendants' personal circumstances before imposing fines, officially adopting what became known as the Caprio standard. Maria Santos became an unexpected celebrity in her own right, speaking at law schools about the power of keeping promises and preserving family legacies. Local television stations produced documentaries about Isabella's 1960s advocacy work, inspiring a new generation of community organizers and legal advocates. The ripple effects of one revealed secret began reshaping how an entire city approached justice, mercy, and community responsibility. The national impact of Judge Caprio's final case reached far beyond Rhode Island's borders, as news outlets picked up the story of inherited compassion and delayed family revelations. Law schools across the country began using the Santos Caprio story as a case study in how personal values shape professional practice and judicial philosophy. The American Bar Association established the Isabella Santos Award for attorneys who demonstrate exceptional commitment to serving underrepresented communities. Municipal courts nationwide reported increased requests from judges wanting training in restorative justice approaches inspired by Judge Caprio's television-famous methodology. Social media campaigns encouraged people to share stories of times when mercy had changed their lives more effectively than punishment ever could have. International legal scholars began studying the Providence model of community-centered justice as an alternative to purely punitive court systems. Maria's 60-year secret had accidentally launched a global conversation about whether justice systems should prioritize healing relationships over imposing penalties. Judge Caprio's retirement became a beginning rather than an ending as he established the Santos Family Foundation, dedicated to supporting community advocates and judicial reform initiatives. Frank began teaching courses at Roger Williams University Law School, sharing Isabella's story alongside his own experiences to inspire future lawyers and judges. Maria Santos, at 85, became a sought-after speaker at conferences about family legacy and the long-term impact of individual choices on community development. The courthouse, where Frank had served for nearly 4 decades, was renamed the Santos Caprio Justice Center in honor of both mother's advocacy and son's judicial service. Young lawyers moved to Providence specifically to work in an environment known for prioritizing human dignity alongside legal procedure. The parking ticket that had seemed so insignificant transformed into a symbol of how small actions can unlock enormous changes when guided by love and moral courage. Frank's legacy expanded from personal reputation to institutional change, proving that authentic leadership creates lasting transformation that outlives individual careers. 5 years after that final case, Providence had become a pilgrimage destination for judges, lawyers, and community organizers seeking to understand how compassionate justice could work in practical settings. The annual Isabella Santos Community Justice Festival drew thousands of visitors to Federal Hill, celebrating both grassroots advocacy and institutional reform. Maria Santos lived to see her 91st birthday, surrounded by the extended family of legal professionals and community members whose lives had been touched by her faithful secret-keeping. Judge Frank Caprio's retirement years were filled with speaking engagements, consulting work, and mentoring young judges who wanted to learn how mercy and law could coexist effectively. The courtroom where their reunion had occurred became a training center for therapeutic jurisprudence programs adopted by courts in over 30 states. Isabella's photograph, once hidden in Maria's purse, now hung prominently in the Providence courthouse lobby alongside images of other community heroes. The legacy of compassion that began with one woman's fight for immigrant families had evolved into a national movement, proving that individual choices, preserved by faithful hearts, can eventually change entire systems of justice and community care. As Judge Caprio's gavel fell silent forever, Maria's 60-year secret transformed not just one family, but an entire city's approach to justice. If this story of inherited compassion and delayed revelations moved you, subscribe and share your thoughts about mercy versus law in the comments below.